In this second set of part 2 for chapter 1, we're going to take a look at the peer group influence, which can be very intimidating or a huge factor with children. And I'm sure if you think back to your own experience, you would probably agree with this very quickly. When we think of peer group influence, it actually does start in preschool, and a lot of times you don't think about those types of things. But in preschool, friendships and attachments are formed through play. And you're going to learn as you get further and further into your program that play is an extremely important part of what happens with children, and play is actually children's work. When we move into middle childhood, peer influence becomes extremely important, and those peer relationships very much contribute to children's development, and we have to have that. One of the things that children can find out is that sometimes other families are looking very much like their own family, yet they function in a totally different way. And that has them start to think about their viewpoints of things that are going on. And again, this is all part of that growing up. One of the things that happens with peer influence is we talk about something called group norms. And you may have heard about this in one of your psychology classes or not, but you learn from your peers how you cooperate with each other, how you socialize according to group norms. And those are group sanctioned modes of behavior. So that group can influence what you value, what you know, what you wear, what you eat, and what you learn. And that can be a good influence, or it can be a very bad influence. So when it's a very good influence, we find that it helps with children, and it's a very coming of age type mediator where you learn negotiating skills, you learn how to deal with different types of hostilities, how to solve problems in a social context. However, when we're talking about that bad end of the spectrum and the bad influence, that's when you see things like blind obedience to a group norm. So that all goes back to this group norming. It can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. But you have children who will do illegal things. It doesn't matter what it is, because it's part of the group, they will do it. So again, that peer influence is very, very influential. Media influence is another very large factor with children. And I really would like you to take a look in your book on page 10. There's a wonderful chart there that talks about all types of influences, media influences on children. And where do you think most children are in terms of that figure? And if you look at some of the things that are there, I think it's clear that music and the arts may not be very large for some groups of children, where the entertainment and electronic devices probably is a large influence on them. One of the things that we're noticing these days is the influence of TV is decreasing. Even though 99% or more than 99% of American households have at least one television set, we are starting to see that this influence is beginning to decrease. However, what is going up is things like the internet and different types of online gaming. So again, you have to think about the types of things that are influenced by television. Obviously, there's commercials. So we have lots of commercials, and children see lots and lots of things going on with that. Some good, some bad. Again, a whole lot of mediation that has to go on with parents, teachers, and everyone else that is in a child's life. We also have media literacy. With all of the new media that's going on these days, it is very important that children learn how to access it, how to analyze it, how to evaluate it, and how to create it. So there are lots of things that we're taking a look at when we're talking about how do we look at the things that children have access to in terms of media. And again, this media literacy is extremely important. Now, when we take a look at these things, one of the things that you want to consider is, do all children have access? So that's one of the points that can be very, very interesting. So we have what is called the haves and the have-nots. So some children have access, some children do not have access. And those that do not, that can definitely put them behind the curve, as you probably well know. Print materials. Well, amazingly enough, look what shows up: books. So books still play a very important part of young children's lives, and they are extremely important in terms of literacy development. One of the things that we're finding out is that print materials now are very much based on TV shows. They're based on computer games. So what we're having happen is children are seeing things in the movies, they're seeing things on TV, they're seeing things in a video game, and what they're doing then is they're looking for the books that go with that. So it's one way that they actually seek out print material. Another thing is we now have a lot of ebooks and websites. One of the ones that you might want to take a look at is something called starfall.com. And we have lots of interactive ways for children to read, but the print materials are very important. Research is showing us that students who have printed materials in their home and they see their parents interacting with these materials, they have increased literacy skills when they get to school. So again, all of this being in the home definitely helps. Another major thing that has been wonderful about all of the diversity and all of the media in the world is we are starting to see a greater view of diversity. We tend to be what they call ethnocentric here in the United States. And we look at the majority culture and we don't see things that are different from the majority culture. And what we're seeing with all of these different media things is this definite positive view of diversity. So that's one of the very good things that's been happening. Let's take a brief look at influence at different age levels. When we take a look at the early years, that's primarily going to be a home influence. So the home is going to be the largest influence at that particular time. We have some theorists that you should be familiar with: Maslow, Erikson, and Piaget, and they are all talking about the fact that young children need to form these positive attachments and support systems as infants and toddlers in order for them to be able to survive and grow and learn in this world. So we have Maslow, and you may have remembered Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, and sort of had like a little pyramid looking thing where we need to meet our basic needs down here at the bottom, which are things like food, shelter, love, in order for us to get any further up this hierarchy of needs to learn. So all of those things need to happen first. If you remember Erikson, he had the different stages. And at this point, his stage was trust versus mistrust. So this was when if an infant is crying because they're hungry, does someone come to feed them? And it allows them to establish that trust relationship with adults. Piaget talked about exploration and construction of knowledge. So you should, at this point in time, know about Piaget and the constructivist theory and his idea of construction of knowledge. So those were three very important theorists in that early years. When we take a look at those early years, we also have some things going on with brain research. And this is a very fascinating area and something that if you want to take the time to look up, you'll hear more about it in more of your classes, but absolutely fascinating information. When you are an infant, your brain starts developing connections. And we're not going to get into all the medical reasons and how that happens. But what happens is there are all these things called synapses in the brain, and all these synapses need to connect. And the more connections you form as an infant, the more you are going to learn, the more you're going to grow, and you're going to just establish multiple connections, and it's so much better for the child. The brain research shows that the environment has a huge part to play in this. So things like housing and where you live are important. Things like caregivers and how your caregivers react to you is extremely important. And these things act in very profound ways with children. So children in positive, secure, and nurturing environments tend to do so much better than children that are in a non-responsive environment. And again, that can be socially, it can be intellectually, it can be emotionally. So it's a very interesting piece of work to take a look at and to keep in mind. So when we find that we have children coming from these less than secure environments, our role as a teacher becomes even more important to help them overcome that setback. Preschool and kindergarten years, again, Erik Erikson shows up, and this is when he's talking about autonomy. And again, if you don't remember all of his stages, please take a look at them in your book and please make sure that you know them. These are very important things to remember as you're dealing with children. Yuri Bronfenbrenner is another very important person to remember, and he was the bioecological model. And he starts talking about transitions that happen from the microsystem at the very lowest level in that circle out to the mesosystem, which is all of the other things that affect the child. And if you remember, there are multiple circles that happen in his bioecological model. So again, transitioning, think about that whole going to kindergarten. So that's another issue there for children in this age group. Again, what is school? Children come to us with many different experiences of school. Some children do not start any school until they do their public education. So they may not start anything until kindergarten. Other children, and I spelled that wrong, there we go, public education. So other children have gone to Head Start. So Head Start is another type of schooling that children may go to. They may go to child care centers. They may go to nursery schools. And all of these things will have somewhat of a different philosophy of what they teach and how things go on. So children will come to you with many different types of ideas of what school actually is. When we move into the primary years, we get to age 8, and the community starts to be a massive influence on the child. So again, how does the family use neighborhood resources? So again, neighborhood differences can be an enormous factor when we're talking about children. And I think I just spelled neighborhood wrong. I have trouble talking and writing at the same time, so we'll get rid of that extra O. So neighborhood differences are extremely different. So if we have a neighborhood that has positive influences, obviously we're going to have positive outcomes for the child. Again, lots of experiences, so the more experience a child has, the better equipped they are to handle school. And what we talk about is these interactions with adults is critical to their development. So these positive interactions give them a good basis for learning and things that they're doing, interacting with others in school. However, when we take a look at coming from a neighborhood that may not be the best influence, and we look at things like poverty, poverty can have a tremendous influence on the children that are coming to us. So again, they don't have the same experiences. They don't have as many positive experiences as the other children do. However, if they participate in community activities, they have lots of chances to practice those problem-solving skills and intellectual skills and those types of things. One of the things that we want to be aware of when we're talking about this whole issue of community influence, and again, it is a very large influence on children. It's absolutely huge. One of the things that we're looking at is there can very often be a high tolerance in communities for things that we would not necessarily consider positive. So there may be gang activity, there may be lots of violence, there may be illicit activities going on. So all of these types of things will have a negative influence. One of the things that works well is the extended family, churches, social and service organizations in the neighborhood can make an extremely positive difference in children's lives. And again, we can help with that when they get to us in school. We also have some special interest groups that we look at. And some of these things are on a local level. And when they're working on a local level, it may be something like, we really want to support our local grocery store. We don't really want Giant in town. And it works for that particular period in time, and then it goes away. Sometimes these things grow and they move to a national type of issue. And one of those things, which your book uses as an example, is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And I'm sure all of you have heard of that, which started when a mother had her daughter was killed by a repeat drunk driving offender. She started a local grassroots effort, and it became a national initiative. So those types of things can happen. We also have some federal special interest groups that are going on. And we have things like No Child Left Behind, which we know has not been a rousing success. We also have Race to the Top, and that's one of the more recent things that we're seeing happening. We have Common Core, which can be very controversial depending on who you talk to. And the interesting thing is we have all of these mandates that come to us from the federal level. And what we find out is that, I'm going to write this before I messed up. Okay, let's go back here. We'll get rid of that. Let me just write this before I talk. Okay, so what we're finding out with the research, and it doesn't really matter what the research says, evidently, to the federal people, is we are finding out that standardized testing, we use it, it results in curricular changes, but it doesn't do anything to help students learn. What we know is what we know about child development is extremely important. And what we know about brain development is extremely important. But what we're doing is we're ignoring those things because of these federal mandates for things that we are supposed to do. So it's a very interesting thing to take a look at. The next thing is the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and you should become very familiar, if you are not already, with this organization. This is the organization that accredits our program. And what this entire class is based on is the NAEYC Standard 2, which is building family and community relationships. Again, this is talking about developing respectful, reciprocal relationships with families and communities in which the families reside. So Standard 2 is extremely important, and that's what we're really talking about in this entire course. And the last thing is, we have many challenging issues that are happening with children today. We have issues of diversity. So how is diversity impacting children? How is media impacting children? We have childhood obesity. 2/3 of children these days are now considered obese. Poverty, 22% of children in the United States live in poverty. And I think we all have seen the effects that bullying have had. So what we need to do is we need to be sure that we're taking a look at collaboration and how can we work with families, how can we work with the community in order to deal with these problems as a group.